Now we're going to take some time to look at part 2 of our reproductive hormones lesson, the female reproductive system. So right here are the two ovaries, and the ovaries are the site for egg development. From the ovaries, the egg is released into the oviduct, which travels all the way down towards the uterus, which is the site of fetal development. The cervix is here at the bottom of the uterus, and its job is to hold the developing embryo within the uterus for fetal development, and then eventually that cervix will dilate and allow the baby to be born through the birth canal, also known as the vagina. The ovary's job is to produce two reproductive hormones, estrogen and progesterone, which we will discuss in further detail later on when we talk about hormonal control. The ovaries also develop the eggs, or the ova. They start off as follicles, and then they mature into an egg cell or an ovum. The oviduct, as mentioned before, carries an ovum to the uterus for implantation, and along the inside of the oviduct, it's fluid filled first of all, and the lining of the oviduct has cilia, and cilia are hair-like projections on the surfaces of cells that sweep the egg towards the uterus for it to be implanted if it's fertilized. The oviduct is also the site of fertilization, so a sperm has to actually travel all the way up the vagina, through the uterus, and then take the right turn to go to the right oviduct where the egg is released to be fertilized. Finally, at the ovary end of the oviduct, there are finger-like projections on the oviduct that are called fimbria. They actually sweep in the ovum into the oviduct during ovulation to make sure that it doesn't, get lost and get waylaid into the rest of the abdominal space. The uterus is also sometimes referred to as the womb, and it is the site for fetal development. So this is where the fertilized egg will get implanted, and then it will reside there for the duration of the pregnancy for the baby to develop. Along the lining of the uterus is a layer of tissue called the endometrium, and it forms here during the menstrual cycle to prepare the uterus for implantation. Basically what happens is a very blood vessel rich tissue develops, and it allows the egg to implant and be nourished until the placenta can be formed. The cervix is at the base of the uterus, and it's a cartilaginous structure that's found between the uterus and the vagina, and its job is to hold the fetus in the uterus along with the mucus plug that forms across the base of the cervix, and it dilates during the birth process to allow the fetus to be able to enter the birth canal. Finally, the vagina is also known as the birth canal. So right now we're going to talk about follicle development. Follicles are structures within the ovary that will develop into egg cells. When a female is a fetus, some cells within the ovary will start to undergo meiosis, and these are called the primordial follicles. And during fetal development, those cells will stop maturing and then wait until puberty. So beginning at puberty and extending throughout a woman's reproductive life, each menstrual cycle, some of these follicles will begin to mature and begin releasing estrogen. So right now they're called primary follicles or primary oocytes, and they still at this point have 46 chromosomes, and they will start developing into a secondary oocyte or a secondary follicle, which now has 23 doubled chromosomes, if you remember back to grade 11 and meiosis 1. As the secondary follicle is developing, fluid starts to build up around it, and eventually it bursts open and it releases the egg into the oviduct to be carried off to be fertilized. The cells of the follicle, these parts right here, remain behind and they don't completely disappear. They actually become the corpus luteum, which will start releasing two hormones, now estrogen and progesterone, which are both hormones that are needed to maintain pregnancy. And then the secondary oocyte enters the oviduct and begins to undergo the second round of meiosis, so meiosis 2. It's not actually completed until after the egg is fertilized. For the next bit, we're going to talk about the menstrual cycle. And the menstrual cycle takes approximately 28 days to complete one full cycle. Now this differs between female and female, and even within a female's reproductive life. So we say 28 days, but it actually could be less or more depending on a person and also depending on the stage of her life. This menstrual cycle occurs throughout a female's reproductive life, so from puberty until she hits the phase called menopause, where no more eggs are left to develop, so she is no longer fertile. There are 3 phases of the menstrual cycle. The first is called the flow phase, which is what we describe when a woman has her period. The next phase is the follicular phase, which is when the follicles are developing. Following the follicular phase is ovulation, which is when the egg is released into the oviduct. And then the final phase occurs, which is the luteal phase. And that's the phase where the uterus and the egg are preparing for pregnancy and preparing for fertilization and preparing for implantation. The flow phase is the first 5 days of the menstrual cycle. Again, this is approximate. So if an egg doesn't get fertilized during the menstrual cycle, the estrogen and progesterone levels will begin to drop off at the end of the luteal phase, and this will cause the endometrium to be shed. So remember, the endometrium is the lining of the uterus that is developed throughout the menstrual cycle, and it's a very blood-rich tissue that's formed. So if fertilization doesn't happen or implantation doesn't happen, the uterus will begin to contract and the endometrium will start to pull away from the uterus and the flow phase will begin. The next phase of our cycle is the follicular phase, and this takes place over days 6 to 13. And in this phase, the follicles are developing in the ovary, and the follicles then begin releasing estrogen, which stimulates the development of the endometrium. So the endometrium begins forming the tissue along the surface of the uterus. And this phase continues until ovulation, which occurs around day 14 of the menstrual cycle. Again, all of these days are very approximate. It's never certain which day ovulation is going to occur. Our final stage in the menstrual cycle is the luteal phase, and this takes place following ovulation all the way up until the end of the cycle, so approximately days 14 to 28. So following ovulation, the corpus luteum begins to develop, and it starts secreting estrogen, but on top of that, it starts secreting progesterone as well. And progesterone's job is to prepare the uterus for an embryo. It also inhibits the release of another egg. This is why progesterone is often used in birth control medications, because it prevents ovulation. So it prevents the egg from being released. And it also confuses the body into thinking that it's already pregnant, which is why it doesn't release another egg. It's really important during pregnancy not to release a second egg, because you wouldn't want to have 2 different embryos developing within the uterus at 2 different stages of pregnancy, because once one is born, the other one may not be viable for survival. If fertilization doesn't occur within the menstrual cycle or at the correct time of the menstrual cycle, progesterone and estrogen levels will start to decline and the uterus will begin to contract, causing the endometrium to pull away, and then the cycle has now made a full circle and the flow phase will begin. So right now we'll talk about how the hormonal control of female reproduction occurs. So first of all, follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, causes the follicles to develop within the ovary. The follicle then releases estrogen, which stimulates the release of luteinizing hormone, or LH. Luteinizing hormone causes ovulation and corpus luteum development. The corpus luteum produces estrogen and progesterone, which then act back on the pituitary to inhibit follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So now we'll talk about oogenesis for a minute. Oogenesis is the process of meiosis within females. And this process takes place between puberty and menopause. So when the woman has no more eggs, oogenesis stops because you can't produce anymore. During fetal development, cells in the ovaries begin meiosis and then they halt and they stop the process of meiosis, and they no longer continue mitosis either, and nothing happens until puberty. And then once puberty begins, only one ovum develops per menstrual cycle compared to the millions of sperm that are made daily in the male. During the process of meiosis, only one out of the 4 possible gametes becomes an egg, and there's a few reasons for that. Firstly, it would be problematic if all 4 of the cells became an egg cell, because then you could potentially fertilize all 4 eggs, and carrying 4 offspring would be a problem. And the other reason why only one develops as an egg is that all the cytoplasm, or almost all of the cytoplasm from each of those possible 4 gametes, gets sent to the one that becomes the egg cell. So then there is a really large food package for the egg to survive on while it's traveling down the oviduct, gets fertilized in the oviduct, and then travels on to the uterus to be implanted, and then it'll continue feeding the embryo until the placenta can take over and start nourishing the embryo.